Before I start, I want to make clear that I'm not a lawyer. Nothing I say is going to be legal advice, and all opinions are my own. In the event that, I don't know, a whole bunch of legal experts tell me I'm totally wrong, I'll take down the video, issue a correction. You know what I won't do? Make a whole career out of it. Last week I made a video about how something as unambiguous as arithmetic could be denied and rewritten to suit political needs, as shown in 1984 the novel and 2019 the year. A major point I made is that in arithmetic you can be right or you can be wrong. But 1984 the novel doesn't concern itself much with arithmetic. Sure, 2 plus 2 equals 5 is shown as the endgame to linguistic reprogramming, but Orwell spends most of his energy on language itself. Much of the linguistic musings were foreshadowed in Orwell's 1946 essay, Politics in the English Language. In this essay, Orwell laments what he sees as the decline of modern English through the mainstreaming of jargon and unnecessarily academic language. Orwell suggests that scrupulous writers ask themselves 4 questions. What am I trying to say? What words will express it? What image or idiom will make it clearer? Is this image fresh enough to have an effect? By fresh, Orwell means to avoid what he calls dying metaphors. He gives at least 13 examples, including Achilles' heel. Most of us are probably more familiar with the expression Achilles' heel than with the actual Achilles myth itself, which I would argue is kind of how idioms get integrated into a language. You don't need to know the origin of Saved by the Bell to use it effectively in a sentence, just as you don't need to know the origin of avocado to have it on your toast. Testicle. Avocado means testicle. Anyway, Orwell's questions here are pretty good, I would say. He prioritizes clarity of meaning over fanciness of word sounds. When I first read this essay as an edgy teenager, who also happened to love linguistics, I thought it was great. Orwell does a pretty good job of showing how ready-made phrases that are over-intellectualized could be used as shorthand for actual honest-to-goodness writing. And of course, we see that all throughout 1984. Newspeak, the official language of Oceania, is described as the only language in the world whose vocabulary shrinks every year. Words like great, excellent, terrible, fabulous are all consolidated onto a scale of good and bad. Newspeak allows for the prefixes double, plus, and un to modify the good and bad, and what more do you need? And we have evidence that the language we speak can affect the way we think. As Tom Scott describes in this video, the same concept, a key in this case, may be described differently by different cultures depending on the grammatical gender. So really, Orwell is getting at the fact that the less we as a culture flex our language muscles, the less exercise our thinking muscles will get. And honestly, this all tracks. But Orwell's essay has one glaring problem. Isn't he doing exactly what Big Brother does? In the pursuit of preserving the language to allow free thought to thrive, Orwell spends a lot of time telling us what not to do. Don't use dying metaphors, don't use noun, adjective, verb operators, don't use pretentious adjectives like, historic. Orwell even goes so far as to discourage using words with non-Anglo origins, including words with Greek and Latin roots. The first example he gives is cul-de-sac, which I guess in the 40s was used to give an air of culture and elegance. Yes, so elegant. All this to say, Politics in the English Language is written by an authority figure telling us what words not to say with the express purpose of influencing the way we think. And it's totally unironic. My biggest problem with this essay is not that it seems to totally contradict 1984, but that Orwell assumes an authority and we're never told why. Sure, Orwell is a fine writer. Both 1984 and Animal Farm have secured his legacy as one of the finest political satirists of the 20th century, certainly in the English-speaking world. But why would that make him an expert on usage? He doesn't do much to explain the potential advantages of foreign expressions, scientific terms, and the passive voice. He just tells you to avoid them all. That's kind of like a cop coming into an elementary school and telling third graders never to smoke weed. Much of this question of authority is tackled, at least indirectly, in David Foster Wallace's 2001 essay, Tense Present, originally published in Harper's Magazine. Tense Present is ostensibly a review of a dictionary of modern American usage by Brian A. Garner. However, in typical DFW style, he doesn't spend all that much time directly discussing the text. Could you imagine trying to talk to someone about literature and all they want to talk about is politics? What he does discuss is the linguistic debate between prescriptivism and descriptivism. Generally speaking, we can think of these two schools of thought in terms of teachers. Prescriptivists are the type of teachers who tell you that your language is wrong and there is an objectively correct way to write the English language. Descriptivists are the types of teachers who have you read Eliot and Cummings. They encourage practices like creative writing. You know the type. As Wallace explains, descriptivists like to think of themselves as impartial observers of the language, while prescriptivists are interested in prescribing rules for proper usage. Take a word like ain't. Mean old prescriptivists, of course, would discourage use of the word ain't. But why? It's a perfectly fine word. You probably know exactly what I mean when I say I ain't hungry. Even though you've probably had it drilled in your head that ain't a word, it's widely used, widely understood, and serves a unique linguistic purpose. The word ain't is equivalent to aren't, isn't, and am not, all rolled into one. Pretty versatile. Of course, ain't ends up telling us a lot about prescriptivism, since it's pretty clear who uses ain't and who doesn't. I grew up in a low income, and because education is commodified in the US, low education area, where words like ain't and brung were more commonplace than their correct counterparts. And these incorrect words aren't arbitrary. Among all sorts of regional dialects, you can find consistency in their grammar and syntax. For example, where I grew up, the words do and don't followed standard written English convention, except in the expression, so don't I, as in, oh man, I left my book bag in the vehicle when we parked back at the crick. That's wicked annoying. I wish I would have brung it with us. Yeah, so don't I. Nowhere else in that regional dialect are don't and do ambiguous, but in this one case they are. And when I was a kid, I always thought it was so wrong. But that's not really fair. Everyone in town seemed to understand exactly what you meant when you said so don't I. So don't I never meant so don't I. And that's all you need to know. How could that be wrong? As Wallace explains in his essay, you're probably fluent in at least 2 dialects of English, one of which is probably standard written English. I might say so don't I on the playground, but I knew that it would be wrong to use it in an English assignment. Wallace makes this clear by comparing students who fail to master proper English with students who can only master proper English, while failing to pick up on the slang and jargon of their peers. The students who know proper English are favored by academia, their teachers, even though they may struggle in communicating with people their own age. Since I'm just speaking from my experience, I've only touched on class, but Wallace spends a little bit of time talking about the racial implications of prescriptivism. When a minority group is financially and academically disenfranchised, it's really messed up for the linguistic community to call their highly developed, grammatically consistent, and widely adopted dialect wrong. And it's wild that someone like William S. Burroughs could basically vomit up a classic novel, while black children are still being told they need to talk white to get ahead. With the clear racial and classist context of these 2 schools of thought, it should be no surprise that Wallace chooses to describe prescriptivism as conservative and descriptivism as liberal. And given everything I've talked about so far, it should be pretty clear that what we call political correctness is explicitly prescriptivist. The idea that Beyoncé should be called black, not African American, is an example of prescriptivism, right? I think it's a little more complicated than that. A lot of descriptivists, including a younger me, like to think descriptivism is more equitable because it is without judgment. But as Wallace notes, there's no such thing as an impartial observer. It requires a naive belief in scientific objectivity, for one thing. Even in the physical sciences, everything from quantum mechanics to information theory has shown that an act of observation is itself part of the phenomenon observed and is analytically inseparable from it. And I've learned this the hard way over the years. I've always described my descriptivism as prioritizing communication above all else. But doesn't that require making a value judgment? Webster's third New International Dictionary of the English Language, which coined the terms prescriptivist and descriptivist, lists the major edicts of descriptivism as follows. Language changes constantly. Change is normal. The spoken language is the language. Correctness rests upon usage. All usage is relative. Let's look at number 3. Spoken language is the language. If we were to be completely objective, this would mean that anything that anyone says would be allowable, even if it hinders communication. And that's where I think we ought to take a step back from hyper-descriptivism. I believe that communication is the most important aspect of language, and that we can and ought to pass subjective judgments based on this metric. If you come to me and say, rah, 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 I would probably say that your language is poor. But if you say to someone else, rah, 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 and they respond with, rah, 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 I have no choice but to accept that your language is valid. And although I'm passing a judgment on the effectiveness of your language, I am not imposing on it any notion of correctness. Although George Orwell wrote a whole novel about how political correctness helps fascists,
Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts.
We have, generally speaking, excellent police forces in the United States.
These wins are possible because of the president's leadership and outsider perspective.
political correctness is most often associated with the left in the US. And the most current issue in political correctness, at least in linguistics, is the use of personal pronouns. So how does this line up with our paradigm of prescriptivism versus descriptivism? Let's take a look at Jordan Peterson. Peterson could be uncharitably described as an amateur self-help author and professional transphobe. Quick editor's note, I actually switched this up. Peterson is a professional self-help author and professional transphobe. He first came to prominence for his response to Canada's act to amend the Human Rights Act and Criminal Code, also known as C-16. The controversial part of the law in question adds gender identity and gender expression as protected grounds under the Canadian Human Rights Act. So basically, you can't refuse to hire or serve someone based on their gender. Pretty straightforward stuff. Perhaps the most extreme suggestion Peterson has made is that if he misgenders a student,
if they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues.
I'm not sure he's suggested elsewhere that he could be jailed for misgendering a student, but I've certainly heard his supporters make this claim, although this is entirely anecdotal. My lay reading of the bill, and this seems to be consistent with Canadian legal experts, is that misgendering someone can be used as evidence of harassment or discrimination, but is not in itself a crime. For example, if your grandmother was in a nursing home, and the nurse kept calling her a man, that could be evidence for an elder abuse case. But a visitor intentionally misgendering her would likely be considered little more than just rude behavior. It's absurd to believe that a district attorney would bring charges against a person for a single instance of misgendering someone. And despite the fact that plenty of legal experts have refuted Peterson's claim, and there remains to be a case like the one Peterson has warned against, he has never issued a correction. It's almost as if he never thought he was telling the truth in the first place. In any case, what Peterson calls compelled speech is not really that. If a person uses they/them pronouns and that makes you uncomfortable, just don't use any pronouns. Use their name. That's what personal pronouns are anyway. They're just linguistic stand-ins for a person, and they're totally optional. No one is suggesting that you have to use any particular pronouns, but using the wrong pronouns could be discriminatory. Just like how you don't have to call Cardi B black, but it is racist to call her the N-word. So you'll notice I went against my descriptivist training and used the expression wrong pronouns. I would argue that this isn't strictly prescriptivist, since we must establish some level of objective truth. As a descriptivist, I don't have to accept that you refer to cats as dogs. It's fascinating and certainly worth studying, but doing so goes against the one thing descriptivists care the most about, clarity of meaning. And here's where Peterson's argument starts to crumble. Peterson suggests that he should be able to use whatever pronouns he pleases since that's how language works. And since he seems to be very pro-free speech and anti-political correctness, you would think that puts him squarely in the descriptivist camp. But I don't know if that's the case. Just as prescriptivists cling on to archaic rules of language, Peterson is refusing to let go of an outdated understanding of gender. Consider the avoid terminal prepositions rule. We all learned that it's correct to never end a sentence with a preposition, but sticking blindly to this rule can actually obscure meaning.
Okay, why don't you put that gun away? What do you need that gun out for?
Don't you mean out for what do you need that gun?
Okay, that can't be right.
It is.
Similarly, misgendering someone out of principle hurts the language and inhibits conversation.
Well, if you and I were to go to a business dinner or any kind of dinner and you were meeting me at a restaurant and I was there first and you had to describe me to take me to the table, you wouldn't say the man in the orange shirt, you would say Blair, you would say her over there.
As a descriptivist, I'm not sure if I can say that misgendering someone is linguistically right or wrong, but I can observe that it is inaccurate and counterproductive to communication. Prescriptivism is oppressive, whether intentionally or otherwise. It is very clearly racist and classist to suggest that something like Naked Lunch is a great novel, while all dialects spoken and developed by black folks have no place in academia. Although it's dishonest, Peterson makes a wise political move by suggesting that he, a wealthy white academic, is somehow on the receiving end of oppression when it comes to the prescription of language. Of course, he's got it backwards. No one is telling him how to speak, but rather how not to speak. And this does inhibit free speech, but so do laws against hate speech, harassment, and defamation. And of course, his refusal to gender people properly is discrimination. He has admitted that he will deliberately misgender non-binary people, but we can pretty safely assume he won't do the same for students whose gender he considers valid. So although he is making an appeal to descriptivism, what I call my students is linguistically allowable, he is actually making a determination that his worldview is the one that should inform language. And you may ask me, aren't I doing the same thing? Yeah, I am. But unlike Peterson, my worldview is informed by reality. Gender is real, and it is a spectrum. Trans people, including non-binary people, are real and valid. This is true whether you want to believe it or not. So where does that place me on the prescriptivist-descriptivist continuum? Who cares? Maybe linguistics isn't the most important thing. As I was writing this essay, I realized I had fallen into a trap. By over-intellectualizing the concept of personal pronouns, by trying to apply a linguistic lens to this debate, I've overlooked perhaps the most important element: the people. Orwell was right to suggest that unnecessarily academic language can dehumanize the subject, and clearly I'm guilty of that. I've tried to make the case that transphobes are prescriptivists in descriptivist clothing, but I don't think that's quite accurate. Just as Wallace describes dogmatic prescriptivists, I think there may be equally problematic anarcho-descriptivists. Those so dedicated to a linguistic Wild West where they're allowed to say whatever they want, reality be damned. But in any case, does any of this matter? If my friend Sam hated being called Samantha and I continue to do it, who cares if I'm being descriptivist or prescriptivist? Who cares if I'm being liberal or conservative? Who cares if my speech is being compelled? If someone asked me to call them something reasonable like Sam instead of Samantha or them instead of him, maybe I should throw out all the lofty talk of political correctness and linguistic dogma and just show some goddamn human decency. When a trans person, or any person for that matter, tells you their pronouns, they're not doing so to advance some
Postmodern, radical, neo-Marxist agenda.
and they're certainly not looking for politics in the English language part 3. They just want respect. Hey everyone, my name is Chris A, and welcome to my Patreon announcement. So if you're like me, you have been out of work for quite a bit because of COVID. And if you're not like me, then maybe you will pay my bills. So I started a Patreon. I've been doing these videos for about a month now, and I'm hoping that maybe in the future we will get to a point where I can monetize them. In the meantime, I am humbly asking you, the viewer, if you wouldn't mind subscribing on patreon.com/xhris_a. I will put a link in the description down below. I've got currently 3 tiers. The first is $3 for what I'm calling a Thatron, which is a gender-neutral patron. I borrowed that idea from Caitlin Durante and Jamie Loftus of the Bechtelcast. Thank you very much. The second tier is $5 a month for a friendo. For that, I will give you a shout out in the description of any video that is published during your subscription. And the top tier is producer. If you have a better name, feel free to put that in the comments, tweet at me. That one's $20 a month, and that will give you the perk of having your name in the end credits. So basically, right here, what we're doing right now. Again, like, comment, and subscribe. If you are in a place financially where you can support me, I would super appreciate that. If you're not, that's fine. You can still like, comment, subscribe, share for free. And if not, that's fine too, because I'm just an internet person. Okay, bye.